Welcome back to True Neighborhood Stories. Sometimes the most devastating battles aren't fought against strangers. They're fought against the very people who are supposed to protect your community. This is the story of a man whose sanctuary was threatened by someone wielding a rulebook like a weapon, and how he fought back when everything he created was about to be destroyed. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Looking back now, I realize how quickly everything you've built can be threatened. My name is Jim Collins, and this is the story of how a passion project that saved my mental health was nearly bulldozed because of one person's interpretation of the words common area. 3 years ago, my life looked completely different. I had a thriving career as a landscape architect for a prestigious firm in Charlotte. My wife, Melissa, was enjoying her 15th year teaching second grade at Pinehaven Elementary. Our son Tyler was just starting high school, getting good grades, and showing a real talent for science. We had the kind of stable, comfortable life that most people would envy. But life has a way of reminding you how fragile happiness can be. It started with a phone call on an ordinary Tuesday evening. My father, who lived alone since my mother passed, hadn't shown up for his weekly card game with friends. I drove over, using the spare key to let myself in when he didn't answer the door. I found him in his garden, the place he loved most in the world, collapsed among his beloved tomato plants. The paramedics said it was a massive stroke. He never regained consciousness. My father was the person who taught me everything I know about plants. Every weekend of my childhood, we'd spend hours tending his garden together. Plants don't lie. To you, Jimmy, he'd say. They respond to care and attention. You get back exactly what you put in. As I watched him being lowered into the ground, those words echoed in my mind. I felt lost without his guidance. The grief hit me harder than I expected. I started missing deadlines at work. I couldn't focus on designs. Plans that used to flow easily from my pencil now felt impossible to visualize. My boss was understanding. At first, but after 3 months of subpar performance, I was called into his office. "Take some time off," he suggested gently. "Figure things out." But we both knew what was happening. 2 weeks later, I handed in my resignation. That's when the panic attack started. The pressure of supporting my family, of finding new purpose, it was overwhelming. During one particularly bad episode, Melissa sat beside me on our bedroom floor, holding my hand while I struggled to breathe. "What would help you right now?" she asked when the worst had passed. Without thinking, I answered, "Digging in the dirt." The next day, she came home with 3 bags of soil and a flat of vegetable seedlings. "Start small," she said, and I did. In the corner of our backyard in Willow Creek Estates, I cleared a 10x10 plot. The physical labor exhausted my body in the best way. The focus required to tend young plants quieted my racing thoughts. For the first time since my father died, I slept through the night. As the weeks passed, the garden expanded. Each new bed represented another piece of myself coming back together. When the vegetables began producing, I'd bring tomatoes to our elderly neighbor, Eleanor Rodriguez. She'd lived alone since her husband died the year before, and our garden conversations soon became the highlight of both our days. She started calling me the plant whisperer, and would sit in her porch rocker watching me work, sharing stories about her nursing career. By the 1-year mark, the garden had transformed the entire southern portion of our backyard. Native flowers attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. A small pond became home to frogs that kept pest insects in check. The vegetable beds produced enough that Melissa started taking weekly baskets to her fellow teachers. Tyler, who initially rolled his eyes at my dirt obsession, became fascinated by the ecosystem developing in our yard, incorporating it into his science projects. The garden wasn't just plants. It was my therapy, my connection to my father, and increasingly our connection to the community. When the local environmental science teacher asked if Tyler's class could visit as a field trip example of sustainable gardening, I was prouder than I'd ever been at my corporate job. That's when I first met Karen Whitfield. I'd seen her around the neighborhood, of course. Everyone knew Karen. She'd moved to Willow Creek Estates 3 years ago and immediately ran for HOA board president. Her campaign focused on property, values, and community standards, words that should have been red flags. But like most homeowners, I paid my dues and ignored HOA matters unless they directly affected me. She showed up during the student field trip, clipboard in hand. While I explained companion planting to 15 enthusiastic teenagers, she circled the perimeter of my yard, making notes and taking pictures with her phone. I thought she might be interested in the garden, so I called out a friendly invitation to join us. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Collins," she said, approaching with clipped steps. "I don't recall the Architectural Review Committee approving these extensive changes to your landscaping." The students fell silent, sensing tension. I laughed awkwardly, explaining that I'd been developing the garden gradually over the past year. "It's just my backyard," I added, "completely private property." Her perfectly penciled eyebrows rose. "Actually, according to the community plat, the southern 8 feet of your yard is technically a drainage easement, which makes it common area under HOA jurisdiction." She tapped her clipboard. "You'll be receiving formal notice about this violation." The science teacher quickly ushered the students toward the front yard to examine the rain barrel system, giving me an apologetic glance. I stood there, dirt under my fingernails, utterly confused. In the 3 years we'd lived in Willow Creek Estates, no one had ever mentioned this supposed easement. True to her word, the violation notice arrived 2 days later. It cited Section 8(4), 2 of the Homeowners Association covenants, conditions, and restrictions. No homeowner shall alter, obstruct, or restrict access to common areas, including, but not limited to, drainage easements, without written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The letter demanded that I remove all plants, structures, and modifications from the common area within 30 days or face fines of $100 per day. I immediately called a friend who worked in real estate to check my property lines. He confirmed what I already believed. While there was indeed a drainage easement notation on the original community plans, it had never been developed or used. More importantly, my deed clearly stated that I owned the property, easement or not. Armed with this information, I wrote a polite but firm response to the HOA, explaining that the garden didn't obstruct any drainage functions and that the easement had never been developed in the 15 years since the community was built. I included photos showing how I'd actually improved drainage with strategic plantings, and requested a meeting with the Architectural Review Committee. Karen's response was a second notice. This one marked final warning, with the fine amount increased to $150 per day. That night, over dinner, I explained the situation to Melissa and Tyler. "Can they really make you tear it down?" Tyler asked. Hawk paused mid-air. He developed a particular fondness for the garden pond and its resident frogs. "They're going to try," I admitted, "but I'm not giving up without a fight." Melissa reached for my hand across the table. "What's the next step?" "I need to attend the HOA meeting next week and make my case directly to the board." I squeezed her hand. "The garden stays." The week that followed was tense. Every time a car slowed in front of our house, I worried it might be Karen conducting another inspection. I researched HOA laws obsessively, printing out North Carolina statutes on homeowner rights and property easements. Eleanor brought over a plate of cookies and her own story about Karen fining her for having a bird feeder that attracted nuisance wildlife. "That woman," Eleanor said, shaking her silver head, "has made it her mission to control every square inch of this neighborhood. Last month, she measured the Johnsons' grass with a ruler, to prove it was a quarter-inch too tall." The evening of the HOA meeting arrived. The community clubhouse was packed. Apparently word had spread about the garden dispute. I spotted familiar faces, the Patels from down the street, the Johnsons from around the corner, even Tyler's science teacher. Eleanor had saved me a seat, in the front row. Karen called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. She wore a beige pantsuit that matched the room's bland walls, her blonde bob so perfect it barely moved when she turned her head. The first 40 minutes were excruciating. Discussions about the community pool schedule, updates on repaving the tennis court, a lengthy debate about acceptable mailbox colors. When she finally reached landscaping violations on the agenda, she straightened the papers in front of her with manicured fingers. "We have several ongoing violations to address," she began, not looking in my direction. "Most concerning is the unauthorized alteration of community drainage areas at 428 Willow Creek Drive." "My address." A murmur went through the room. Karen clicked to a PowerPoint slide showing aerial views of my backyard. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With red circles highlighting the garden beds. As you can see, this homeowner has completely obstructed the drainage easement with unauthorized plantings, potentially creating flood risks for neighboring properties. I hadn't realized she'd gone so far as to get aerial photographs. My face flushed with anger, but I reminded myself to stay calm. The board recommends immediate remediation, including removal of all non-approved plantings and restoration of the easement to its original state. She finally looked at me. "Mr. Collins, you have exceeded the 30-day notice period. Fines will begin immediately unless remediation starts within 48 hours. When she asked if anyone had questions or comments, I raised my hand. Karen nodded reluctantly, and I approached the small podium. "Thank you for bringing this matter to the board's attention," I began, using every ounce of professional composure I'd developed in my previous career. "I'd like to clarify a few points. First, my deed confirms that I own the property in question, easement notation notwithstanding. Second, the drainage easement has never been developed or maintained by the HOA in the 15 years since this community was built. Third, my garden actually improves water absorption and reduces runoff through sustainable design practices. I displayed my own photos showing how the garden handled the heavy rainfall we'd received the previous week. Finally, I continued, Section 14, 3 of our own HOA covenants, states that the Architectural Review Committee must respond to improvement requests within 45 days, or the improvement is automatically approved. I submitted landscaping plans last year when I installed the pond and never received a rejection. This was a slight stretch of the truth. I'd submitted plans for the pond specifically, not the entire garden, but the principle was the same. Karen's expression darkened. That submission was for a water feature only, not for converting the entire easement into a wildflower meadow, she countered. A native plant garden, I corrected, which serves both aesthetic and functional purposes for the community. It supports local pollinators, reduces water usage, and serves as an educational resource. I gestured toward Tyler's science teacher, who nodded encouragingly. Karen's smile turned brittle. While your hobby may be educational, it violates clear HOA guidelines. This isn't personal, Mr. Collins. Rules exist for a reason. I took a deep breath. If this isn't personal, why am I the only homeowner being targeted for easement violations? The Patels have a storage shed in their drainage easement. The Andersons have a playset. What makes my garden different? Those are approved structures, Karen replied, but I could see some board members exchanging uncomfortable glances. I respectfully request that the board review all the documentation I've provided and postpone any fines until a proper assessment can be conducted. I handed copies of my research to each board member. If this garden truly creates drainage problems, I'll be the first to address them. But so far, it's only improved our local environment. When I returned to my seat, Eleanor patted my arm. "You did good," she whispered. The board moved to executive session to discuss the matter. While we waited in the lobby, neighbors approached to offer support. Ravi Patel confirmed that his shed had never been formally approved. Lisa Johnson admitted she'd been afraid to plant flowers because of Karen's scrutiny. It seemed I wasn't the only one feeling the weight of arbitrary enforcement. After 40 minutes, we were called back in. Karen's face was tight with controlled anger as she announced, "The board has decided to postpone fines pending further review. An independent landscaping expert will assess the drainage function of the area in question. Until then, no changes are to be made to the current plantings." It wasn't a victory, but it was a reprieve. As people filed out of the meeting, Derek Johnson clapped me on the shoulder. About time someone stood up to her. That night, I felt cautiously optimistic. The board members seemed reasonable, even if Karen wasn't. Surely an objective assessment would validate that my garden posed no drainage issues. Melissa and I celebrated with a glass of wine on the patio, watching fireflies rise from the native grasses as dusk fell. "I'm proud of you," she said, leaning her head on my shoulder. "This garden brought you back to us. I'm not letting anyone take it away." I kissed the top of her head, grateful for her unwavering support. "One battle at a time," I replied. 2 days later, I came home from grocery shopping to find a large white truck parked in front of our house. 2 men in khaki uniforms were examining my garden. While Karen stood nearby, pointing and gesturing, I hurried from my car, grocery bags forgotten. "What's going on here?" I demanded. One of the men turned, extending his hand. "Mr. Collins, I'm Brad Wilson from Pinehaven Public Works. We're here about the drainage easement." "I thought an independent expert was supposed to assess the garden," I said, looking directly at Karen, who had the decency to avert her eyes. "This is standard procedure for easement violations," she interjected. "Public Works needs to ensure no drainage functions are compromised." Brad seemed uncomfortable. "We received a complaint about obstruction of a municipal drainage easement. We're just here to evaluate." The HOA board voted to postpone any action pending an independent assessment, I reminded Karen, struggling to keep my voice level. This wasn't what was agreed upon. "The board authorized me to pursue all appropriate channels," she replied smoothly. "Public Works is the appropriate authority for drainage issues." Brad and his colleague continued their inspection while Karen watched with barely concealed satisfaction. I called Melissa, who left school immediately and arrived just as they were finishing up. "What's the verdict?" she asked, slightly breathless from rushing. Brad glanced at his clipboard. "Technically, this is a Type B drainage easement, which means no permanent structures or plantings should obstruct potential water flow." He looked genuinely regretful. "Some of this would need to be modified to comply with county regulations. But this area has never functioned as an actual drainage channel," I protested. "There are no culverts, no grading, nothing to indicate it's an active drainage system." "The easement is on the books," Brad explained. "Even if it's not currently developed, we need to preserve the county's ability to utilize it if necessary." Karen's smile was triumphant, "As I've been saying all along." But Brad wasn't finished. "However," he continued, looking at my garden thoughtfully, "the county has recently adopted new guidelines for green infrastructure. Some of what you've done here, the rain garden, the native plantings, actually aligns with our stormwater management goals." Karen's smile faltered. "I'd like to propose a compromise," Brad said. "If you're willing to make some modifications, creating a clear channel through the center, reducing the height of some plantings to ensure water flow, we could potentially approve this as an alternative compliance method for the easement." It wasn't ideal, but it was far better than tearing everything out. "I'd be happy to work with you on modifications," I agreed quickly, before Karen could object. She wasn't giving up that easily. "The HOA covenants still require architectural review committee approval for any landscaping in common areas," she insisted, "even if the county approves it." Brad looked between us, clearly sensing the tension. "I'll write up my recommendations and send them to both parties," he said diplomatically. "From the county's perspective, environmentally sensitive solutions for easements are preferred when possible." As he and his colleague returned to their truck, Karen stepped closer to me. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "That garden violates multiple sections of our covenants, regardless of what the county says." "Why does my garden bother you so much?" I asked, genuinely curious. "It's beautiful, it's educational, it helps the environment. What exactly is the problem?" Her expression hardened. "The problem, Mr. Collins, is that if everyone did whatever they wanted with their property, this community would descend into chaos. Today, it's your wildflower jungle. Tomorrow, it's pink flamingos and car parts on the lawn." "That's quite a slippery slope," Melissa remarked dryly. Karen ignored her. "The board meeting is in 2 weeks. I suggest you start planning for removal, regardless of what that county employee said." With that, she turned and walked to her car, her posture rigid with determination. As we watched her drive away, Melissa slipped her hand into mine. "She really hates plants, doesn't she?" I laughed despite the knot in my stomach. "She hates not being in control. The garden is just collateral damage." That evening, as I watered the very plants that had caused such controversy, I realized this fight was about more than just flowers and vegetables. It was about healing, about community, about standing up to petty tyrants who hide behind rulebooks. My father would have told me to dig in my heels just as firmly as I dug in the soil. I looked up to see Tyler watching me from the patio. "Are they really going to make you tear it down?" he asked. "Not if I can help it," I promised. "Some things are worth fighting for." With Public Works assessment providing some leverage, I had 2 weeks to prepare for the next board meeting. I wasn't going down without a fight. This garden had saved me during my darkest days. Now it was my turn to save it. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. I reached out to every neighbor who had expressed support at the meeting, creating an informal alliance of homeowners tired of Karen's rigid enforcement. Eleanor became my most dedicated advocate, making phone calls and collecting signatures for a petition supporting the garden. The Patels offered their legal knowledge, reviewing the HOA bylaws for procedural violations in how my case had been handled. Most surprisingly, Tyler took the initiative to create a presentation on the environmental benefits of the garden. Working with his science teacher, he compiled data on native pollinators, water conservation, and the positive impact on local wildlife. His passion moved me. Something of my father's legacy had truly passed to the next generation. Meanwhile, I implemented the modifications Brad from Public Works had suggested, creating a winding channel through the center of the garden where water could flow freely during heavy rainfall. I documented each step with photographs, building a comprehensive case for how the garden enhanced rather than hindered the easement's function. 3 days before the board meeting, Brad delivered his official report. The document confirmed that, with my modifications, the garden actually improved the drainage capacity of the easement while providing environmental benefits. He specifically noted that the county's new green infrastructure initiative encouraged exactly this type of sustainable approach to stormwater management. Armed with Brad's report, neighbor testimonials, and Tyler's research, I felt cautiously optimistic about the upcoming meeting. Melissa helped me prepare a concise, professional presentation, drawing on her years of classroom experience to make the information accessible and compelling. The night before the meeting, I walked through the garden at sunset, savoring the gentle buzz of bees among the coneflowers and the splash of frogs diving into the pond at my approach. This place had become my sanctuary, a living memorial to my father and a symbol of my recovery. The thought of losing it still made my chest tighten with anxiety, but I reminded myself that regardless of the outcome, creating it had already saved me in ways I couldn't have imagined. The second HOA meeting had an even larger turnout than the first. Word had spread throughout Willow Creek Estates, and many residents came simply out of curiosity. Karen called the meeting to order with visible irritation at the crowded room. Her demeanor was frostier than usual as she moved mechanically through the agenda items, clearly eager to reach the garden dispute. When she finally announced, "Unresolved landscaping violations," the room fell silent. Karen briskly summarized the previous discussion and the public works assessment, noticeably omitting Brad's positive comments about the garden's environmental benefits. While the county has suggested modifications rather than complete removal, she concluded, the fact remains that this installation was never approved by the Architectural Review Committee in clear violation of our covenants. She nodded toward me, her lips a thin line. "Mr. Collins, you may address the board." As I approached the podium, I noticed something I hadn't seen at the previous meeting, genuine interest in the faces of the other board members. They leaned forward slightly, their expressions thoughtful rather than dismissive. I began by distributing copies of Brad's full report, then launched into my presentation. "This garden has evolved into more than just a collection of plants," I explained. "It's become a community resource and an example of sustainable landscaping that benefits our environment, our property values, and our quality of life." I detailed the drainage improvements, the reduction in water usage compared to traditional lawns, and the educational opportunities the garden had already provided. As I spoke, I could see heads nodding throughout the audience. Most importantly, I concluded, this garden restored something that was broken in me. After losing my father, I lost myself too. Every plant in that garden represents a step back toward wholeness. I've made all the modifications Public Works recommended, and I'm willing to work with the Architectural Review Committee on any reasonable adjustments. But I'm asking you to recognize the value this space brings to our community and allow it to remain. When I finished, Karen immediately tried to move to a vote, but another board member, Janet Winters, who I knew worked as an environmental consultant, raised her hand. "Before we vote, I'd like to hear from other residents," she suggested. "Since this affects our community standards, we should consider community input." Karen couldn't reasonably object. Eleanor was the first to speak, her voice slightly shaky but determined. "I've lived in Willow Creek for 12 years, she began. "Jim's garden is the most beautiful addition to our neighborhood I've seen. I sit on my porch every morning watching butterflies and birds visit those flowers. It's brought life back to a place that was starting to feel sterile." Ravi Patel spoke next. "My children have learned more about ecosystems from visiting Jim's backyard than from any textbook. If we truly care about property values, we should be encouraging this kind of thoughtful landscaping, not penalizing it." One by one, neighbors stood to voice their support. Even people I barely knew expressed appreciation for the garden's beauty and the precedent it set for more sustainable yards. Tyler's science teacher spoke about its educational value. The Johnsons mentioned how the native plants had inspired them to reduce chemicals in their own lawn care. Throughout these testimonials, I watched Karen's expression harden. She tapped her pen impatiently against her notepad, occasionally checking her watch. When the last neighbor finished speaking, she cleared her throat. While these personal opinions are touching, they don't change the fact that HOA covenants were violated. Rules exist for a reason, and selective enforcement undermines the entire system. Her gaze swept across the room. If we make an exception here, where do we draw the line? Janet from the board leaned forward. Perhaps the issue isn't whether to enforce the rules, but whether our rules need updating to reflect current environmental priorities and community values. She turned to the other board members. The county is already moving in this direction with their green infrastructure initiative. Maybe our covenants should too. I held my breath as the board members exchanged glances. After a brief discussion, they voted to table the violation and form a committee to review the landscaping guidelines with specific attention to environmentally sustainable options. In the meantime, my garden could stay with the modifications already implemented. It wasn't an outright victory, but it was far better than I had hoped. As the meeting adjourned, residents gathered around, asking questions about specific plants and water conservation techniques. Several requested tours of the garden for ideas they could implement in their own yards. Even 2 board members expressed interest in seeing it firsthand. Karen watched this impromptu gathering from across the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. When our eyes met briefly, I saw something unexpected, not just anger, but genuine bewilderment. She truly couldn't understand why anyone would want to break from the uniform aesthetic she valued so highly. As the crowd thinned, I found myself standing alone near the exit. Karen approached, her heels clicking sharply on the tile floor. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "The committee will establish proper guidelines, and your experiment will need to comply." I nodded, surprising both of us with my calm response. "I look forward to working with the committee. Change can be good for communities just like it's good for gardens." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't understand what's at stake. Consistency and order are what keep property values stable." "Maybe there's room for both order and creativity," I suggested. "Not everything beautiful fits in straight lines." She shook her head and walked away, posture rigid with disapproval. I watched her go, feeling an unexpected twinge of compassion. How exhausting it must be to live in such fear of variation and change. The 6 months that followed brought remarkable transformation to Willow Creek Estates. The landscaping review committee, which eventually included me, Janet from the board, and surprisingly Brad from Public Works as an advisory member, developed new guidelines encouraging native plants, rain gardens, and other sustainable practices while still maintaining aesthetic cohesion. My garden became a model for the community, with monthly open houses where neighbors could learn about specific techniques. Eleanor's yard now featured a butterfly garden. The Patels installed a rain barrel system. Even the Johnsons, who had previously maintained the most traditional lawn on the block, created a small meadow in their backyard. Karen remained opposed to these changes, but found herself increasingly isolated as the community embraced a more natural approach to landscaping. When the next HOA election came around, she didn't run for board president, a position that was filled instead by Janet, who ran on a platform of sustainable community development. One afternoon, as I was dividing perennials to share with neighbors, I looked up to see Karen standing at the edge of my garden. She had never visited before, and her presence was so unexpected that I nearly dropped my trowel. "Your black-eyed Susans are quite vigorous," she observed, her tone neutral. "They're great for butterflies," I replied cautiously. "Would you like some for your yard? I'm dividing them anyway." She seemed to consider this for a moment. "My grandson is visiting next month. He's 7 and apparently obsessed with butterflies." She sighed lightly. "Perhaps a small butterfly garden wouldn't be terrible." I carefully placed some divided plants in a pot and handed it to her, soil and all. She accepted them with gloved hands, holding the pot awkwardly. Just plant them in full sun and water until established, I advised. They'll pretty much take care of themselves after that. She nodded stiffly. Thank you. After a brief hesitation, she added, Your father taught you gardening, I heard. Everything I know, I confirmed. Mine forbade anything but grass. Said gardens were messy. Something in her expression softened momentarily. Perhaps that's why I've always preferred order. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, black-eyed Susans in hand. I watched her go, understanding dawning like the slow rise of morning light. We're all shaped by our past, all fighting our own invisible battles. Karen's rigid adherence to rules suddenly made more sense. They were her security in a world that must have often seemed chaotic and threatening. Standing there, hands deep in soil that had helped heal my grief, I realized the true power of gardens. They don't just grow plants, they grow understanding, community, and sometimes unexpected bridges between people. My father was right. With plants, you get back exactly what you put in, care, attention, patience, but sometimes you get something even more valuable, a reminder that growth, in all its forms, rarely happens in straight lines. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.